right, let's talk about training our raters. So, just to give you an overview, there is rater error training, which is going to focus on showing raters how to avoid the errors. This doesn't necessarily improve accuracy. You can tell people about the recency error or leniency or these other things. You can tell people about that. But they tend to think that's what other people do. They don't tend to think, oh my gosh, I'm doing it, right? Here in my little cartoon, I guess that's not a cartoon, my little picture, he's thinking, impressive. She talks and speaks just like me. Let's give this a higher rating, right? So when our training focuses on trying to reduce those errors, it doesn't necessarily achieve the goal. If, on the other hand, we engage in what's called frame of reference training, we can focus on helping the rater to notice the relevant behaviors and categorize those behaviors accurately. So it's enhancing their observational skills and enhancing their categorical skills. And this helps if all the raters go through this training, it helps to put everybody in the same common framework. And that actually helps to improve appraisal accuracy because everybody's kind of got the same basic training. Everybody's applying it in a similar way, and that produces better outcomes. I'll give you kind of a small example. It's not an employment example. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of something that school kids K through 12 can engage in called Destination Imagination. And it's a program where the students have a very tiny budget to work with, and they have to solve some kind of problem that follows a theme every year. And there's different categories and so on. My kids did it for several years. And so, generally, if you have a Destination Imagination program in your school, you want to have somebody who volunteers to be a judge, right? To give back and make the thing run. So I volunteered to be a judge. I figured I'm very judgmental. I'd be good at it. And so one of the things I loved about their rater training, because we all had to go down for like a full Saturday and do our rater training. You had to go every year too. So I went to it multiple times. One of the things that they really encouraged us is the first group that you're evaluating, they get 3s. Like that's it. On a scale of 1 to 5, everybody gets, that first group gets a 3. That is going to be our baseline. And then everybody else is going to be better or worse than that baseline. And that's going to help us to be able to quantify what we're looking at, because these are all very destination imagination. It's all very creative stuff. It's hard to compare them to each other. Oh my gosh, I would say near impossible to compare them to each other. And so you have to have something to start with. So they trained us what to look at, what we're all going to be looking at. These are the criteria specifically that you're going to be looking for as you're judging the performance or the piece that they've created. So what to look at, and then how to categorize it. So the first one, we would write down like what things we were looking at, and we would, make sure that we were giving good feedback to the group as we were giving them 3s, right? And then with the next group, mentally, our categorization was better or worse than the last group on each of these criteria, right? And of course, giving copious feedback and things like that, so that unfortunately, if the first team out was the best team of the day gets 3s. The ideal situation is that like a middle of the road one shows up first, and then you've got some that are better and some that are worse. Like that's the goal. But sometimes it happens that you've given them 3s and they turn out to be the best, or they turn out to be the worst group of the day. But at least we were all trained. This is how we're starting. This is how we're doing it. So we were all working from the same frame of reference. And so that's how rater training works. And that is an effective one. Telling them all the things that I told you in the last video about errors, that does not help raters at all. They don't think they're making the error. If they knew they were making the error, they wouldn't do it. So they don't think they're making it, so they make it again. It's a kind of cognition 101. They don't think they're making that mistake. So rater training, the frame of reference is much better. Now, rater goals and accountabilities. So raters' goals vary. Like I said earlier with some of the errors, Sometimes the rater wants to be seen as a nice person or a good person, or maybe they want to be seen as a tough person or whatever. It's not always that they're rating in a way that helps the organization, helps the person being evaluated. Sometimes it's about them as the rater. So you have different goals, organizational goals that might be being held. Helping my coworkers goal is my goal, or helping myself is the goal. They vary on what their goal is. So holding them accountable for being accurate, holding them accountable for being too lenient will help raters to be more consistent in how they're applying their ratings. So that rater might give the consistent kinds of ratings when they are doing ratings of their employees. They might be consistently wrong. They might be overinflated. They might be underinflated. They might be clustering too much around the mean number. They might be consistently wrong in a certain way, right? But they are consistent, and that gives information to the organization that they can use. Because, okay, so these are coming from Jill, and she's always really lenient. So let's keep that in mind. And so looking for any, information that would allow us within the context of that, as long as Jill's being consistent, we can at least interpret what those ratings mean. It turns out that raters that are higher in conscientiousness tend to be affected more by accountability pressures. So when you have conscientiousness as one of your hiring goals, right, one of the ways that it can pay off is that it leads to people who, once they are in a position where they get to do ratings, if you give them this kind of accountability, like we're expecting you to give us accurate information. We don't expect you to be using this rating process for anything other than giving us accurate information about the employee. They are much more, people who are high in conscientiousness are much more likely to fall into line and give honest evaluations. People who are lower in conscientiousness are going to tend to, fulfill their own goals instead. All right. So how about some research on performance appraisal? One topic is the issue of the social psychological context. So early researchers, they really focused a lot on how to design the rating scales. They really spent a lot of time trying to figure out, how can we make good checklists? How can we make good graphics? How can we make good bars systems, right? Like, they're really focusing on all of that. They were so nuts and bolts back in the early days of research. And so they were really trying to figure out which was the best structure for a rating. They also there was a lot of effort put into figuring out what kinds of factors go into rating errors. So they were trying to figure out what cognitive errors people make. Okay, those were things that were really fascinating. Much more common today to be looking at, the social psychological process, the context that goes into the ratings that people make. When we talk about context, there's social context, there's the legal context of the rating procedure, the political ramifications, and I don't necessarily mean like who's president. I mean political ramifications as far as like getting along in the workplace, the organization, right? A lot of times you're playing politics at work, and so trying to get along, fit in, fulfill what might be conflicting goals. You might be being told by some people in management that the goal is to grow and develop the employees. You might be being told by other people in management that the goal is to find the best employees, because we're going to have to actually start laying some people off, and we want to keep the best employees. There might be some politics going on that can have an impact on ratings. Emotional climates. There's some circumstances you don't feel very safe, giving your honest opinion and giving honest feedback. And so if you're in that kind of, emotional pressure cooker, it's going to be difficult to get accurate ratings from raters. If you have, an emotional culture that's going on in the organization where, there's a lot of competition and a lot of sort of jockeying for position and things like that, you could end up having a lot of difficulty, developing good rating procedures that are accurate and trustworthy. Another issue that researchers have looked at is something called reaction criteria. So the role of the rater and the ratee reactions in the performance process is what we're talking about here. Sometimes the people who are being rated react very badly, defensively, angrily, things like that. Sometimes the rater has very bad reactions to having to do ratings. I remember my first class I ever taught. I was still a graduate student, and I was walking to class carrying my pile of exams to administer, and I felt like I was going to the guillotine or something. I did not want to go give an exam. I know it's not exactly the same thing as performance appraisal, but it's very similar, isn't it? That, some amount of time has passed in this class. It's time to find out what you have, encoded into your memory. I thought, like, as the rater, I did not want to do it. I'm like, do we have to do exams? I feel really bad. I don't want to do this. What if my exam isn't very good? What if I didn't teach properly? What if this? What if that? It all went perfectly fine, and students take tests the way students take tests. It was all fine. But I was full of angst. I didn't want to do that at all. And so, there is, on the rater side, there are issues. Like I said, nobody wants to administer performance appraisals for lots of reasons. And of course, there's part of the reason why people don't want to do it is the possible reaction of the person who's been rated. It turns out that the satisfaction is affected by performance appraisal characteristics and organizational variables. So what does that mean? The rater and the ratee feel better when the performance appraisal is well designed, it's clear, it's full of actual behavioral examples rather than generalities. The employee tends to do best if the feedback is put into context for them, so that they don't see every single little tiny thing that could be construed as negative, but instead get a big picture overarching characterization from the rater. And then, of course, organizational variables. If the organization gives the impression that two performance evaluations with scores below X, and you're on probation, and like these kinds of things, there's going to be a lot more, stress and less satisfaction in the performance appraisal process when you really feel threatened by it, right? When you really feel like this is potentially a bad thing. So subordinates tend to be less angry, and they tend to have higher perceptions of justice when the rater justifies the ratings. And that doesn't mean they defend their ratings. It means when they make ratings, they include behavioral examples, objective behavioral examples. And then performance appraisals are more likely to be viewed as unfair when they are I've read that back. Performance appraisals that are viewed as unfair tend to contribute to that employee experiencing emotional exhaustion. That ratee who has just received a performance appraisal that maybe doesn't have behavioral examples, or that focuses too much on the negative and not enough on the positive things that employee is bringing, stuff like that. Those employees tend to say things that make us think that they are emotionally exhausted, burnt out, maybe they've developed some learned helplessness, where no matter what they do, it doesn't matter anyway, that kind of frustration. So having well-designed, well-substantiated, not in a defensive way, it's really important to mention that. It's not that you give these ratings and then when the employee says, well, but I do that, and then the employer real quick thinks of an example when they didn't do it. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying in the actual performance evaluation, you have, here's a 3 on this category, and here is my evidence for why. And objective and nice. One of the things I used to do when I was grading papers, particularly like research methods or 309 papers where it's sort of APA format, and this might be the student's first time trying to write in this formal way, is what I used to do is say things like, you need to include this. You left out the comma. You did this. You did that. See what you already can tell what's wrong, right? You. So what I've started doing lately, and students didn't necessarily like it. They would get defensive as they were reading my feedback. And then they would do like little retaliations where they'd be like, I can't read your handwriting. What does this say? And things like that. One of the things I've noticed since I flipped that language and started to just say, need a comma, please rephrase, like that, I'm not seeing any defensiveness as a response to my feedback. You feels like an attack. Need a comma feels like a grammatical comment, right? And people are less defensive when it's phrased in a more neutral and less accusatory way. The supervisor-subordinate relationship is another area of research that's been really growing lately. The leader-member exchange theory says that the employee-supervisor relationship affects the performance appraisal process. The frequency of communications predicts the ratings both directions. So what the research has really suggested is that it's to the organization's best interest to make sure that there are frequent opportunities for communication among leadership and employees. Among the employees, you want to build those relationships and have people communicating because you tend to have more information and better information the more times that you communicate and interact with each other. So that's a big advantage. I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and we'll come back and talk about organizational politics as a research topic in the next video.